Welcome to our fourth talk in a series of conversations accompanying the exhibition Eco Games, which is currently at display at the ZKM Karlsruhe and part of the computer game exhibition Gameplay the Next Level. My name is Laura Schmidt. I'm the curatorial assistant of the exhibition, and today I'm very happy and honored to welcome Alenda Chang as our guest and to have her with us for the next hour. Welcome, Alenda.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Before we start our conversation, now I'd like to shortly introduce you to the audience. Alenda Chang is an associate professor in film and media studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and author of the book Playing Nature, Ecology in Video Games, published in 2019. She is co-director of the digital media studio Wireframe, which aims to encourage critical engagement with social and environmental concerns in new media. And furthermore, she's co-founding editor of the open access journal Media and Environment. Today, we're going to talk, among other things, about ecology in games, ecology in games, environmental game design, and about what has changed since the publishing of Playing Nature. But let us start at the beginning. Your book is one of the key texts, if not the key text, when it comes to environmentalism and ecology in game studies. How or why did you start focusing on games and ecology? And was there something you were especially interested in when you started researching for Playing Nature?
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I don't know. I feel a little humbled, and there's so much new research that we'll talk about later. But I really do hope that Playing Nature ends up being helpful to people that are interested in this area, whether it's designers or researchers. But in many ways, I feel like I was just through my childhood and upbringing and my training that I was just in a good position to explore this topic. So I kind of have this joke that my father was a fish. It's like the Faulkner reference. My mother was a fish, a little less disturbing, but he and my mother both came to the United States as immigrants in the 60s to go to graduate school for science, one in fisheries biology and one in zoology. So in many ways, even though they went on to do other things, I feel like I was sort of raised by scientists with a lot of animals around. And so I kind of grew up and had this left brain, right brain training where I was really interested in biology and the life sciences and neurobiology, but I was also really in love with literature and the arts. And by the time I made it to graduate school, I didn't go to school thinking I was going to write about ecology in games at all. But what ended up happening is I was invited to write about games for a special issue of the journal Qui Parle, and discovered that really the games community, the game studies community, and the people who really did environmental criticism the best at that point, which was the literature folks, weren't really at all in conversation with each other. And in fact, they were kind of unable to converse with each other because the vocabulary just wasn't there. And so on one side, it was hard to conceive of non-literary texts in an environmental critique sort of mode, but that has obviously changed. And now it's film and arts and interactive media. But at the time, nobody was sort of writing about games in that way. And then in the game study side, there was a lot of obsession over sort of aspects of the medium, narrative, gameplay mechanics, a lot of things that are important to hash out at the start of a subdiscipline. But I was really surprised that we weren't getting discussion about the kind of cultural impact of games and the way that it sort of measures our response to environmental issues and crisis. So I guess for me, it's like a very low hanging fruit. And I felt like I had the skills to kind of take it on, and I had the real interest and passion in those topics. So that's kind of what brought me there.
What does it mean to talk about ecology in games or ecology in games? What different aspects have you found and do you think are important?
Oh, that's a good question. I think a lot of people see the word ecology in the subtitle of the book and recoil because they think, oh no, this is going to be, you know, a celebration of capital S science, or you know, it's sort of not as appealing to humanists. But I really do think that I really think there's a fundamental similarity between what players do and what scientists do. And I actually say players and not game designers, even though there is a similarity on that front as well. But there is just the spirit of experimentation and curiosity that characterizes both scientific work and gameplay. And for me, ecology and environmental studies, which are actually very different in their approaches, those kinds of areas of thinking helped me to pull out terms that I thought were really defamiliarizing and helpful as a heuristic to think about games and game environments. So terms like edge effects, mesocosm, scale, a lot of that is coming from these disciplines, and they're the titles of some of the early chapters of the book. And I think the reason it makes sense is I was really focused on how games depict systems and how they depict the interrelations of entities and processes in those systems, particularly environmental ones, but it could really apply to many other things. And so, you know, to me, it seems pretty clear that games are artificially designed and constrained systems, and they're creatively constrained. And in many ways, experiments, the kind of experiments that scientists conduct, whether in the lab or in the field, are also creatively constrained. And they're systems, subsets of the world, right? And so it was just really productive for me to put these realms together. And I think scientists have done a lot of sophisticated thinking about terms like scale, and it helps us to be a little bit more rigorous in game studies, but there's also a sort of two-way interchange, right, where games can also offer something back to science as well. And I think we'll talk about that in a bit.
When talking about games and ecology, what do you think is the biggest potential for games in this context?
Yeah. Well, there are so many, and it's almost hard to pick one. But I do think I talk about affordances and how games have these particular affordances or kind of capacities that I think are really well suited to dramatizing environmental crisis. It doesn't even have to be crisis. It could just be environmental states and relations. And one of them, for instance, would be scale. So I have thought a lot about the sort of scalar flexibility that games give you. And I think anybody who's ever played one of those quote unquote God games, where you're sort of a, you know, unseen supernatural being kind of taking care of a population or a town or whatever, knows that you can play at these different scales. You can be right down there, you know, in the first person. You could be sort of a, you know, 2D, 3D perspective, isometric, whatever. And there are games now that really let you play as the smallest particle of the universe all the way up to, you know, the level of galaxies. And I think it's interesting how games allow you to compress and expand both space and time. And it is very artificial and sort of simplified, but I think it's a useful simplification. And it's something that humans aren't particularly good at by nature. We're not very good about thinking past our own generation or maybe our children's generation. We're not very good at thinking about what lies beyond our borders or in habitats that are not ours. You know, the blue humanities is a huge thing right now to kind of acknowledge the importance of the oceans and aquatic environments. And I think games allow that kind of exploration, and it also does it in an ethically unencumbered way, which is, I know that sounds weird, but you know, the one thing that games do better than science is we can actually you know, cause catastrophe and ecological collapse and see what happens and kind of play that scenario out, whereas scientists obviously can't do that willy-nilly in the environment. They have to wait opportunistically for things to happen and then study them. And so I think games just providing that space to kind of play out environmental scenarios. But on the other side, that's less scientific. I think ecology only got me so far, and affect was really important too. And the ways that games also make us feel was ultimately very important. And in environmental psychology, they talk about this all the time, where science only gets you so far. So kind of going to a climate denialist and saying, but look at the facts, doesn't really get you all that far, right? You still also have to persuade them, or at least to meet them where they're at and sort of have a kind of understanding in a conversation. And that's, I feel like games can do that. They sort of take the pressure off.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. I mean, especially when talking about empathy, you've got a chapter in your book, which is called Nonhuman, which is not only about what I'm going to ask you, but it's also about that. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering what possibilities there are for games to actually foster empathy for non-human beings and offer a change of what you just said perspective. Is there an example, or what can we learn from or through games about cohabitation, respect, and interconnectedness, for example?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I definitely wanted to devote a chapter of the book to questions of the non-human or more than human, because I find animal studies really interesting. And I think I have a sort of, having been raised by these proto-scientists, I really feel like I have a deep and abiding respect for non-human species. And not necessarily the charismatic ones, because everyone sort of cares about the large, fuzzy, charismatic megafauna that exist out there. But, you know, I was raised around lots of fish, which are not particularly charismatic, but, you know, I find them fascinating as well, and also very intelligent. So it's, you know, this is the question of empathy is really tricky, and it's been sort of taken up in queer game studies around games by sort of avant-garde experimental game makers like Entropy, who make games about the experience of, for instance, gender dysphoria. And then they often get labeled as empathy games. Like it kind of, it's a little bit too, it's a little reductive to think that you can really know what it's like to walk in that person's shoes by playing a game version, right? And Entropy has said that Dysphoria, the game, was really not for just like anybody, but it was really about, it was a game by a trans woman for other trans women. And so, so knowing that, I feel like we could have a similar conversation about the limits of games for creating empathy with non-human beings, because ultimately we cannot know what it is to be a bat. And like, I think Thomas Nagel, there are lots of famous philosophers who have sort of thought about this question, right? And have been unable to kind of come to an answer, right? So we cannot really know what it is like to be a bat, or even our companion species, like our pets, that I think we suspect we have a pretty good clue, but ultimately still may not know exactly what's going on. But that's okay, actually. I think games, all of our media, all of our culture is inevitably going to be anthropocentric. And as long as we know that, I think that's okay. And we can still have these creative experiments where we play as animals. And actually, I had just downloaded the game Shelter 3, and this is a Swedish studio, Might and Delight. You can watch me playing very badly as the matriarch of this elephant herd. So just keep in mind, I had just started this, and so I was unfamiliar with the controls, but I had played Shelter 1 and Shelter 2. So Shelter 1, you played as a mother badger, and you had to take care of your 5 badger cubs and protect them through 5 levels or so from, oh gosh, everything. It was very stressful. So you had to make sure they didn't starve. So you had to feed them, but you also had to protect them from predators, both in the air and on the ground. You had to protect them from natural phenomena like floods, fires, and other kinds of dangers, right? And so Shelter 1 was badgers. Shelter 2 was a lynx game. So you played as a mother lynx, and you also, again, had cubs that you had to take care of. And that was incredibly stressful as well. But it had interesting dynamics like heat vision. So you, as sort of an apex predator, you could see the heat outlines of rabbits and sort of chase them with bursts of speed. And this one is so fascinating. You can see, you walk out and you end up in this lake, and then it tells you, hey, this is how you play in the water. So that's me playing in the water with my trunk. And I have there's like a little a calf that's my color that you also have to nurse. And so the challenge, you didn't see the beginning of the game, is that there are elephants and remnants of your herd that are kind of spread all around, and you have to try to reunite them. I think that's the goal of the game. And so I really like this one because not only are you sort of taking a non-human perspective, but it's also about animal sociality, which I think is hugely important. And elephants are a wonderful species to take on because we know that they're so intelligent. We know that they, for instance, mourn the loss of members of their herd, right? And so all these things that scientists and people over time have posited as being unique to humans, like tool use, language, the ability to grieve, have steadily been disproven, right? That we can find animals like these that show us that we're not unique in that way. So I just think, yeah, games just have this power, and you can watch people playing Might and Delight games and crying, and also just feeling great shame over being bad animal parents, which I think is kind of hilarious too.
Definitely. I don't remember the name now, but I came across a project which was a master thesis, I think, and it was 3 animals. I think it was the vision of 3 animals, and also the way you moved was trying to mirror how these animals would move. So there was like a caterpillar, and you would have to move your mouse forth and back to move forward. I don't know. I found that it was not very long, and it was more of an experience. I'm not sure whether you could call it a game, but I thought it was very interesting because suddenly you would perceive the world in a different way, which you would normally not be able to.
Yeah, I think that actually sounds really interesting because you can see from this clip that I was kind of hovering in this, disembodied perspective above the elephant, right? And so it doesn't quite give you that sense of I am exactly this elephant. And it's so clear to us that animal perception is different, that they see parts of the visible spectrum or parts of the spectrum that are not visible to us. Or they see only in black and white, or they see, heat signatures, that sort of thing. And so a game that would allow us to do that and to perceive differently would actually be really powerful, I think.
Definitely. I mean, being at that point now, I would like to ask you how we could define environmental games, or what characteristics do they have to meet? Where is the potential? Also, where's the potential? What is an environmental game?
Yeah, and this has been characterized all these different ways, like eco games, right? Is the sort of one term. Green games, though I kind of resisted kind of calling it green games because of the tendency to do greenwashing, to kind of label things as sustainable or green when they're not really sustainable or green. And I do think environmental games, or a term like that, is more, it allows for more to be included, including games where you're very destructive and you're doing things to the environment that you wouldn't want to do if you were a conservationist, for instance. So I think an environmental game to me is one in which the game environment is not just a backdrop, or is not just a sort of resource to be used, but is actually both essential to the game experience and has an agency of its own. And so, I've played so many games. I think we've kind of grown up playing them. And I think there are so many games where the environment is really just picturesque scenery, or if you're playing something like a real-time strategy game, like the old Warcraft series or StarCraft, that kind of thing, the environment is really just, a mining node and lumber nodes and sort of, it's there in that colonialist sense of like resources for the taking in order to build civilization. And so it's almost an afterthought. And I think those are both ways that we do use the real environment. But I think I want games where the game environment actually surprises us. I want games where when you put the controller down and walk away, the game keeps going. And then the environment sort of has a life of its own. And so games that can actually surprise me with what happens are always really fascinating to me. And so, and the other caveat here is that a lot of people assume that means that a really good environmental game has to be a AAA blockbuster game like Red Dead Redemption or Red Dead Redemption 2, where the environment is, trillions of polygons and you can just sort of like love the scenery around you, right? But no, I actually explicitly say in the book, and I draw on my literary background here, that even a game that has no graphics, like Colossal Cave Adventure from the 1970s, which is like Zork, you just use a command line prompt and type words into it and you read the descriptions. Even that for me is actually an environmental game, because the developer, Chris Crowther, and then later Don Woods, but Chris Crowther was somebody who spent a lot of his free time exploring caves. And then he wrote this game that is about exploring a cave. And it's based on a real cave system that's in the United States. And, if you read the descriptions, it's not generic. It reads like somebody who knows caves really well, like has been in them and understands geology and how human bodies can fit in that geology. And so to me, that's an environmental game because it embeds the developer's sort of embodied knowledge of the world inside the game. And it's also meaningfully site specific. So I don't know, that's a lot. It's a lot to put on one game or one developer, but any of those things I think can make a really interesting environmental game. So yeah, I hope that helps. And then I did want to say really briefly that lately I've been obsessed with digital plant modeling. So I don't know, I feel like there may be like 3 people in the world that are excited about this, but I'm really interested in companies like SpeedTree that make digital trees and plants. And they make them for games, for cinema, for television, for architecture. And increasingly the plants that we see in our media all around us are actually these digital constructs. So if you've seen Avatar the movie or Game of Thrones the TV series or Sesame Street or played any AAA game, chances are you've seen a SpeedTree, right? And it's really, to me, it's fascinating because depending on the company or the approach, the trees are either more like theater flats where they just sort of get rolled into place and they look really nice from the front. But if you were able to actually walk around to the back, you would see there's nothing there. Or, you can see like that they've been cut and pasted. It's like literally the exact same tree across the landscape. But there are companies, there's actually one in Germany, I think it's, what is it called? Laubwerk? Does that mean like foliage or like,
yeah, it does. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So they are actually founded by these research scientists who wrote a whole textbook on the digital design of nature. And they're actually trying to incorporate botanical principles and morphogenetic principles into their design, so that that's really exciting to me, because you might get like a plant or a tree that actually grows toward the sun or grows away from a wall, right? And so I'm excited about that, at least. I'm the only one.
Yeah, I can understand that a lot, because I had a class at university where we were doing a 3D design and all that. And I was so obsessed with nature like recreating nature, because I don't know, it was, I remember my first environment, which was full of grass, because actually there was an eco game conference last month, and there was one talk about grass.
And that was Merlin Seller. Yes. Yeah, he's the other person who's interested. So you, Merlin, and I are the only three people who are very interested in this.
And yeah, definitely. I don't know. It took hours to render. I think it was for like, I don't know. We had to hand in something. I was the whole night rendering the grass. But
I find it fascinating because computers are not. Even though they're really powerful now and they keep getting more powerful, they're still not up to the real complexity of nature. So that when you have scenes like that, or I think of the game Flower, which is just seas of grass, it's all uniform grass, except that, there will be one blade of grass that's broken in the forefront or something like that, or a tree that has a weird, like a gnarly limb. And that is enough of an anomaly to kind of indicate realism. It's just sort of a shorthand for this is a real environment. It's not just uniform generated grass. And that's sort of a sleight of hand, right? But yeah, I think there's definitely more to be done there. So maybe my next book.
Fair enough. Getting back to On Track, in your book, you also, I mean, this comes also somehow with nature and how difficult it is to actually process and render and all this. So you talk about the physical environmental impact of video games and the video game industry. And I wanted to ask you to actually talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the two later chapters in the book are Entropy and Collapse. And I sort of, collapse is a kind of a environmental, ecological idea of going past the point of no return. But entropy is more of a physics sort of thermodynamic principle. But I really wanted to address not just sort of the content of games, like looking at them through this eco-critical analysis frame, but also to think about the sort of environmental footprint of the game industry. And my work has actually been kind of heading in this direction. And I often teach digital media, not just games, but just digital media to undergraduates in a large lecture course. And I like to remind them that, if you have a smartphone or any kind of like contemporary smart device, that as Benjamin Bratton has written in the stack, that we're all carrying bits of Africa around in our pockets, right? And so thinking not just about the computer as a media aesthetic device, but also as this part of a political economy and of global supply chains. And everyone's actually super attentive to supply chains right now. So maybe they're just like, oh, of course. But outside of the pandemic, it wasn't as easy to kind of make this point that, our games are products, and our games and our game hardware are products of these global dynamics that are often really inequitable between the global north and the south, or the developed and developing worlds. And I think I really love this concept that my colleague Lisa Parks has of not just media, like a media device, but actually an energy media matrix. So it's this idea that we now need to be a little bit more attentive to how things are powered and the infrastructures behind them. So rather than just saying, I have a phone, it's a lithium ion battery powered phone, right? Instead of a copper wired analog phone that we used to have, or I used to have, I'm older. And I think I've also been writing about cloud gaming and the carbon footprint of that, and just thinking about the infrastructures of play that exist to support play. And I think the industry has a real problem, unfortunately, with these cycles of planned obsolescence, where it's not quite as bad as iPhones, but with the game consoles, where it's like, oh, I need to have the newest, the best PlayStation or Nintendo or whatever it is. And so I do think it's time for a reckoning. It's obviously always time to fight for the right to repair our devices. And yeah, I think there are steps being taken. And I have been working with this climate special interest group of the International Game Developers Association, or IGDA, which is a volunteer-run group that is trying to actually create attention and momentum within the game industry around issues of climate and climate justice. And so that's really exciting. And I do think, as you know, a lot of the people in the workforce are younger, and I do think that younger generations have grown up with climate and environmental crisis as a core part of their being. And are acknowledging that older generations have done a pretty poor job of addressing those aspects. And so I'm excited to see what comes of that. So what comes of that within the industry, if there will be that reckoning.
Yeah, totally. I was also wondering, I mean, especially what you said with cloud gaming and what we were talking earlier about nature or video game environments, which get ever bigger. And I was also wondering, with technology getting more efficient, that's what they are working on. But I mean, there is another concept, which is sufficiency. And what could sufficiency look like when talking about video games in the video game industry?
Yeah, I think that's great. I'm not a huge fan of Moore's law. So I always throw these things out to my students and say, you know, Moore's law is in some ways something that has been an aspiration to, you know, double computing power. And we're kind of reaching quantum limits now, but then they're finding other ways to maybe increase efficiency. And I do think sufficiency is a better term. Or we could use subsistence. It'd be really interesting to think about subsistence gaming. And I do think, I forgot to mention the game Phone Story by Mole Industria, which is an art collective that often makes these political satire games. And this one's meant to be played on your phone, but since I think, well, the famous story is that it was banned within 7 hours from the App Store because it's really a critique of Apple and other kind of smartphone makers. Because there are 4 levels. One is about coltan mining in the Congo, where you're sort of playing these armed overseers supervising child laborers, and you have to keep them from resting in order to pass to the next level. And the second level, you'll see in a second, takes place in China at Foxconn factories that are actually Taiwanese company, but where they were having quite a bit of worker suicides. And so you're kind of like trying to save the workforce, right? It's really not about the workers themselves, but as about maintaining the supply chain for phones. And then the third level is actually, I think you're playing as like a Apple Store employee. I think it was an Apple. They had to change it to a Pear for infringement reasons. But you know, these are rabid consumers trying to storm the store for the latest generation phone, and you have to, you know, lob it to them to keep them from crashing into the windows, you know, in their craze. And then the final level is an e-waste processing level, where you have to sort the components coming out of the conveyor belt to the appropriate toxically exposed, undernourished human. You know, one is melting motherboards, another one's like doing chemical processing, another one's just straight up burning stuff, and another one's melting things. And so you know, it's a real indictment of the supply chain of video games. And I think there are some interesting responses to this. The kind of idea of the right to repair, also the idea of imposing kind of artificial limits on ourselves. So some people are very into retro games, or setting artificial constraints on memory or processing. I think that will still remain a fairly small segment of game development, but I think there's a film theorist, Laura Marks, who actually published in Media and Environment this provocation about streaming media. And she was saying, after working with scientists to calculate the kind of cost of streaming 4K video, or, you know, binging Netflix, where she makes the comparison between really high quality video and having a glass of wine or eating a steak, like a nice steak at a restaurant, right? And so it's, in some ways, I think the challenge is to change the mindset, and rather than sort of just gobbling up all this media all the time, without a thought to the costs or the sources and sinks, that we would acknowledge it as the culmination of resource intensive processes, right? And as a privilege. And I think that would be a really big step toward that.
Yeah, totally. What comes to my mind is a project from Chris De Decker, I think is his name, which is Low Tech Magazine. Actually,
I've seen that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's working with the same principles. Well, it's a web page which is basically super low resolution. Also, it's a static web page, and it runs on a solar server. So he is making all this point about whether web pages really have to have all these advertisements, and whether all those advertisements have to be videos. And he's talking about how big internet pages have actually grown since the beginning.
I think that's great, because there needs to be, I think he's not the one, but there are people who are saying there should be speed limits on the internet. But yeah, why do you, if you're in a distracted state playing a game on your phone on the subway on the way to work, do you really need it to be in like crystal clear, you know, these are sort of these minute decisions that all add up.
Yeah, totally. I mean, since you've written your book, there have been, 2 years have passed now.
Yeah, almost. It's pretty crazy.
And there's been a pandemic in between, and I don't know, what has changed? Is there something that has changed since you've written your book? Is there something you would underline more? Is there something you would wanted to add?
Yeah. Yeah, in some way. There are always things you want to change after you let a piece of writing go. But I think, you know, my excitement is that I had a lot to say, but I knew that it wasn't all that there was to say, but I wanted to start the conversation. So it's been really exciting for me to see all these other people who have also been interested in this topic, and to see a kind of momentum building around this. And then I'm happy for them to disagree with me and to take my ideas further or to contest them, because it's all in the service of understanding this really rich cultural form and this really important topic, or kind of historical moment. So I'm happy with that. I would say if there are any changes, if anything, that the climate crisis has gotten more and more urgent. I already knew it was urgent, and I already was wrestling with that. But my work, as I mentioned before, has been moving more and more to the infrastructure side of things and thinking about how changing climate itself is making conditions more precarious for all forms of play. And so oftentimes I will talk about things like outdoor sports and winter games, like the Winter Olympics. And it's not that I'm a huge sports fan or anything, but it's because a much broader audience can understand that or even soccer, you know, summer sports too. But the fact that we have to move the world finals of the FIFA World Cup, you know, because of the season and the temperatures that would be happening in the host city, or that we're building these huge air-conditioned stadiums to keep the temperature at 85 degrees. You know, it's kind of these wild things, or that we have to build these huge solar canopies on top of brand new stadiums because the sun has proven too hot on the fans in the stands. And so these realities help me to connect to computer and console games, because even though we're hiding in our rooms playing our games, we also create microclimates within those rooms. They get really hot if you've ever played, you know, in a closed room at night for many hours. Not that I've done that. But you know, it's we increasingly rely on these technical solutions to that, like fans, really big fans, or, you know, like a liquid cooling or air conditioning, right? We had these monster heat waves in the United States recently in parts of the country that don't typically need air conditioning. And after that, there was this huge rush to go install air conditioners all over the Pacific Northwest, right? And of course, people have the right to control, you know, to be able to live, right? But it's not an ultimate solution, right? And so I think these kinds of, like, we see the microcosm and the macrocosm of the changing climate impacting play. And I find that really interesting. And like I mentioned before, I'm obsessed with plants and how, and plants, not just plants, but also other digital forms of nature, and how, you know, we have this problem of being blind to most of it all the time, because when we play, we don't tend to pay attention to those things, but I do. And so to kind of, I think I'm also working on the sort of digital asset modeling and thinking about how that has increasingly come to replace our experience with the world. And it's not necessarily to say that's bad, everyone should just go march out into the woods, right? Because that's not a solution either. It's very romantic, but but that maybe we should pay more attention to the quality of those assets. So I guess, yeah, I don't know. I still think there's a lot to do in this area. It won't all be done by me, thank goodness. But yeah, it's just, I still think there's much to be done, and I'm still interested in this. But as I'm researching, I'm seeing that it doesn't just apply to games. So like I mentioned before, a lot of these digital assets are spread across the culture industries, and in some ways, games are just the bellwether. Like you can see in games, it's a convenient case study, but it's applicable to a much broader range of things.
Totally. I mean, if games also add to the problem, then back to the beginning, what can games, I mean, does it still make sense to actually play in this in this context, or would it be better if we just stop playing and, as you say, go out, even though if it's romantic to think so?
Yeah. I mean, I never want people to think that I am not a fan of actual direct experience of nature. I do think that is important, but it's not the solution in the way that a lot of sort of environmental educators see it, I think, where they see electronics and games especially as an enemy, as something that sort of like takes away our attention from the natural world. And I understand why they're concerned about that, especially for children. But that, you know, games and mediated experiences can still give us very valuable experiences of nature. And that nature is always somewhat artificial. Like there's always been this really weird divide between nature and us, or technology and nature. And those, when you really start to analyze those divides, it's not tenable because, you know, we are nature, humans are nature, the things we make are nature. Yeah, I mean, we get really important cultural conceptions of nature through the things we read, the things we watch, the things we play, right? So I do think it's still, this is the question. I always, when I have these kinds of critiques of the industry and sort of shame about some of the things that are going on, I'm not telling people they have to throw their PlayStations in the river or something like that, but that they should just be mindful. And, you know, I still think it goes back to that science versus emotion question earlier, which is games are kind of a neglected medium for communicating climate crisis and for sort of touching people in an emotional sense, and making them reflect on systems and on system change. And so I would never get rid of them, right? I would want them just to be more environmentally intelligent, and I would want players to be more environmentally cognizant. of their impacts and the impacts of the industry, and to hold developers and companies to a higher standard, right? And so, yeah, I don't think we have to stop playing. And I actually did a presentation recently on this exact question of why play when the world is on fire, kind of like literally on fire in California near me. There's a fire right now. And it's because there's a great quote by the botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer in Braiding Sweetgrass, where she says, "Play is the way we limber up for the work of the world." And I love that, right? Because it is this idea of, play can actually be hard work. If you've ever had to play with like an 8-year-old like I do, it's actually a lot of work, right? To kind of like sustain play and to give yourself over to play in a way that's not just shallow, right? You actually commit to it. And I think that's a kind of model for engaging with things. It's also for our mental health, because it's very easy to fall into nihilism and despair, in the face of all of these things. And I think we need ways to connect and to find joy and hope and resiliency. And games can be one of those things, along with lots of cookies, right? And I don't know what else. So I think that, yeah, we still need to play, and hopefully young people will lead the way.
Yeah, well, yes, I agree. Also, I think there are many environmental games actually appearing. There have been, I don't know, I have the feeling that recently there have been more and more games appearing. Do you have an idea why that is, or?
Well, because our world is on fire. It's becoming impossible to ignore. But I also think it is because the generations reaching adulthood and also the workplace are, like I said, I think there's this great book, I actually have it here, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety by Sarah Jaquette Ray. And it's really written for Gen Z. And it kind of acknowledges that Gen Z is the most diverse and multicultural generation yet, but it's also the one with the greatest debt. It's the one facing the greatest mental health crisis over climate and other matters. It's more likely to be politically disengaged, which is surprising. And so there are all these things that are kind of happening. And I feel like games are naturally reflecting the concerns of the generation that's making them, right? Obviously made by many different people of many different ages, but it's almost, to me, it's like an unavoidable result that all of our culture and our media are going to reflect this situation.
Do you have a closing recommendation for a game, maybe?
Well, I think you had mentioned the Eco Games conference, and there was a wonderful presentation about survival games, which I think you can easily critique because they are kind of that resource model of using the environment to kind of create a place for yourself. But there is one that's in early alpha right now called Among Trees. I think I gave you a clip of it. And it's just really beautiful. And I don't typically like to play survival games where it's very stressful, like The Long Dark, where immediately you're in the frozen wilderness and you have to light a fire so you don't die, right? But this one, it was much more calm and peaceful. You get a fox friend.
I started playing this game. I was going to say spoiler alert before, because I didn't know that there was an animal companion. And I was like, oh my God, I didn't get to this point, and I had abandoned it again, but I will definitely get back to it now.
Well, I have to admit though, when I played it on the least stressful mode. I think it's called Zen mode. So that in this game, there are bears, if you're playing on normal, where they can be aggressive, and they are often kind of around places that have interesting things for you to collect, like supplies. But I didn't want to deal with that. So there are no bears in this version. The most stressful thing is bees. You can get stung by bees. But you can see it's so beautiful. It's very reminiscent of Firewatch, actually. And I do think, there's a case to be made for, playing games like these and kind of having just like a simple experience. I think I'm trying to go fishing and I don't do very well. So don't judge me too harshly. And there's another game that I didn't give you, but that I've been playing a lot. And it's part of this new genre of cozy games. And it's called Cozy Grove by Spry Fox. And it's a game where you play as a young Girl Scout or Boy Scout, except that you commune with spirits of the undead. And you go to an island and you have to talk to all these deceased bears and help them to gain peace with their former lives. And then in the process, you're sort of also restoring the island itself and all of its inhabitants. And I think that's really interesting because when people think cozy, they often think indoors, like human domestic spaces. And actually, this is a cozy island. A cozy outdoor space. And so I think that's also kind of could be really interesting to think about.
Great, thank you. I'll put that on my list and I hope to be playing it very soon.
Watch out. It'll be very, it's actually good because you could only do so much every day and then you can log off.
Oh, that is good. Yes, that is good, especially when you don't have a lot of time for playing anymore.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for your time and the wonderful conversation. I'm definitely very excited to see how things are going to develop for the gaming industry and for video games as such. And thank you everyone for watching and have a good evening. Bye for now.